Hey there everyone, today we're going to continue reading Gilles Deleuze's Difference and Repetition. This time we're going to look at Chapter 3, The Image of Thought, which amounts to a summary critique, really of philosophy in general. It is seeking to find the pre-philosophical grounds that are determining the way philosophers usually go about thinking, in a way that is actually dogmatic and focuses on reducing thought to a number of structures, which are going to interfere with the possibility for genuinely radical ways of thinking. Now, Deleuze opens by explaining what exactly the image of thought means. And this is like the capital I, image of thought. This is the dogmatic way in which the world is reduced in thought. He writes that the philosopher, it is true, proceeds with greater disinterest. All that he proposes as universally recognized is what is meant by thinking, being, and self. In other words, not a particular this or that, but the form of representation and recognition in general. This form, nevertheless, has a matter, but a pure matter or element. This element consists only of the supposition that thought is the natural exercise of a faculty, of the presupposition that there is a natural capacity for thought, endowed with a talent for truth or an affinity with the true, under the double aspect of a good will on the part of the thinker and an upright nature on the part of thought. It is because everybody naturally thinks that everybody is supposed to know implicitly what it means to think. The most general form of representation is thus found in the element of a common sense understood as an upright nature and a good will, eudochos, and orthodoxy. The implicit presupposition of philosophy may be found in the idea of a common sense as cogitatio natura universalis. On this basis, philosophy is able to begin. And he goes on that postulates in philosophy are not propositions, the acceptance of which the philosopher demands, but on the contrary, propositional themes which remain implicit and are understood in a pre-philosophical manner. In this sense, conceptual philosophical thought has as its implicit presupposition a pre-philosophical and natural image of thought, borrowed from the pure element of common sense. According to this image, thought has an affinity with the true. It formally possesses the true and materially wants the true. It is in terms of this image that everybody knows and is presumed to know what it means to think. Thereafter, it matters little whether philosophy begins with the object or the subject, with being or with beings, as long as thought remains subject to this image, which already prejudges everything, the distribution of the object and the subject as well as that of being and beings. So what Deleuze is trying to point out is that in fact the way we usually go about thinking, for example with Descartes, where he does his whole, doubting all that is possible to doubt, and he realizes the one thing he can't doubt is the fact that he is a thinking thing, a cogito. But people like Heidegger, for example, look at this and they say, well, you haven't actually told us anything about being. You've just said you're a thinking thing without explaining what are means, or what it even means to think, is what Deleuze is trying to point out here. That in fact the reason we take it as something we don't really need to think about is because everybody thinks, so it's presumed that everyone knows what thinking means in general. And Deleuze's project here is to uncover what are the actual presuppositions in thinking itself. And he's trying to get us to be liberated from the image of thought as such, which is to say the capital I image, the presupposition that grounds certain restrictions of thought as such. Now, one of the contentions that he takes is with Kant and Descartes and Plato, which all presuppose a unity of thought, which really this is the unity of the self that he spoke about in the last chapter, which he's trying to go against. He postulates, or rather problematizes, by way of 1,000 little selves. And in so doing, he's trying to get rid of this notion that thought is this perfectly causal, perfectly unitary phenomenon. He writes that thought is supposed to be naturally upright because it is not a faculty like the others, but the unity of all the other faculties, which are only modes of the supposed subject, and which it aligns with the form of the same in the model of recognition. The model of recognition is necessarily included in the image of thought, and whether one considers Plato's Theaetetus, Descartes' Meditations, or Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, this model remains sovereign and defines the orientation of the philosophical analysis of what it means to think. But, Deleuze writes, such an orientation is a hindrance to philosophy. The supposed three levels, a natural upright thought, an in-principle natural common sense, and a transcendental mode of recognition, can constitute only an ideal orthodoxy. Philosophy is left without means to realize its project of breaking with doxa. And really what he's trying to get at here is that thought is presupposed to have a unity which is going to ground what it means to differ from that image of thought. It's going to naturally delineate what it means to engage in proper dialectics or critique or meditations, where, for example, with Descartes, it's not just an innocent meditation. It's built on the implicit and often pre-philosophical presupposition that the self is this unified thing grounded in, of course, the constancy of God, right? The fact that God imparts a unity upon the self, which, that's a presupposition if there ever was one. Now, what Deleuze points out is that, in fact, this notion of the cogitatio natura, the naturally thinking thing, the common sense, which grounds much of the notions that we use only in a pre-philosophical, unreflective manner, that in fact this is all oriented towards a sort of conservatism. He writes that insofar as the practical finality of recognition lies in the established values, then on this model, the whole image of thought as cogitatio natura bears witness to a disturbing complacency. As Nietzsche says, truth may well seem to be a more modest being from which no disorder and nothing extraordinary is to be feared, a self-contented and happy creature which is continually assuring all the powers that be that no one needs to be the least concerned on its account, for it is, after all, only pure knowledge. What is a thought which harms no one, neither thinkers nor anyone else? Recognition is a sign of the celebration of monstrous nuptials, in which thought rediscovers the state, rediscovers the church, and rediscovers all the current values that it subtly presented in the pure form of an eternally blessed, unspecified eternal object. So these presuppositions of the cogitatio natura universalis really takes the biases which already existed in thought and establishes them as something eternal, something ensured, something that will ground thought before one goes into it, which is basically a way to say keep one's biases before one actually starts thinking, such that it's no wonder that Descartes is going to rediscover God after his meditations, the way he goes into, his meditations, the way he seeks his foundation for his first philosophy is in an unreflective notion of the unity of the self and of thought in the power of God. And his summary critique of representation is really in here. That the image of thought stands as representation in thought itself. It is the presupposed ideal notion of thought which is said to ground thought, but in reality creates the circularity of thought. Deleuze writes on page 138, "The I think is the most general principle of representation. In other words, the source of these elements and of the unity of all these faculties. I conceive, I judge, I imagine, I remember, and I perceive, as though these were the 4 branches of the cogito. On precisely these branches, difference is crucified. They form quadripartite fetters, under which only that which is identical, similar, analogous, or opposed can be considered different. Difference becomes an object of representation, always in relation to a conceived identity, a judged analogy, an imagined opposition, or a perceived similitude. Under these 4 coincident figures, difference acquires a sufficient reason in the form of a principium comparationis. For this reason, the world of representation is characterized by its inability to conceive of difference in itself, and by the same token, its inability to conceive of repetition for itself, since the latter is grasped only by means of recognition, distribution, reproduction, and resemblance, insofar as these alienate the prefix re in simple generalities of representation." And there's so much in this passage that I just read, which is so important for understanding Deleuze's philosophy. And really, this is arborescent thinking as it appears in A Thousand Plateaus. They critique it in the rhizome plateau. They critique it in the postulates of linguistics with regards to Chomsky's linguistics. And all of this is predicated on a universal which grounds difference. And in so grounding difference, can only conceptualize difference as identity, which is to say, as a purely conceptual subsuming of difference to the identity of a category we already know. In addition, it is reduced by analogy, which judges the object in order to reduce it to something familiar. Or this difference is subsumed based on opposition, based on the notion of the negative, which is really imagined, because it assumes that thought must always play itself out in a symbiotic relationship, that it must be perfectly oppositional in all cases, such that the negative can act to prop up our presuppositions we already have. And it can be reduced by similitude, which is, of course, just reducing through perception the presence of that difference. And what all this does is creates an inability to conceive of difference itself. Difference can only be reduced by this dogmatic image of thought. In contrast to this, Deleuze states that thought is primarily trespass and violence, the enemy, and nothing presupposes philosophy. Everything begins with misosophy. Do not count upon thought to ensure the relative necessity of what thinks. Rather, count upon the contingency of an encounter with that which forces thought to raise up and educate the absolute necessity of an act of thought, or a passion to think. The conditions of a true critique and a true creation are the same. the destruction of an image of thought which presupposes itself, and the genesis of the act of thinking in thought itself. And this is really a revolutionary sort of pragmatics in which he's critiquing representation, which operates on this presupposed unity of the good will, for example, which writes off difference in an effort to save the subject. But instead, Deleuze wants to advocate a sort of fatalism, a violence in thinking itself, which tears apart the very unity of thought itself precisely in the encounter. And the encounter is a crucial element of the destruction of the image of thought, which we'll get into a little bit later. He wants to imagine something in the world which forces us to think, as he says it. He says that this something is an object not of recognition, but of a fundamental encounter. What is encountered may be Socrates, a temple, or a demon. It may be grasped in a range of affective tones, wonder, love, hatred, suffering. In whatever tone, its primary characteristic is that it can only be sensed. In this sense, it is opposed to recognition. And this is an important element of Deleuze's critique of dogmatic thinking, is that in an encounter, which is necessarily a pragmatic encounter with the world, an extra thought mode of thought, in the form of an encounter which doesn't reduce to something we can conceptualize, but hits us and it breaks our foundation precisely to show that the only foundation is the eternal return of violence, of the other, of misosophy, as he puts it. Now, in this, he focuses a lot on critiquing Plato, but also showing how potentially, even in Plato's philosophy, there were little moments where his thought had the possibility to breathe the fresh air of the revolutionary image of thought. He writes that having discovered the superior or transcendent exercise of the faculties, Plato subordinated this to the forms of opposition in the sensible, similitude in reminiscence, identity in the essence, and analogy in the good, with a capital G. In this manner, he prepared the way for the world of representation, carrying out a first distribution of its elements, and already covering the exercise of thought with a dogmatic image which both presupposes and betrays it. And that's important insofar as really the way he's critiquing Plato is very similar to Judith Butler, herself indebted to Deleuze, when she critiques gender, in which Plato is, grounding his ontology in these transcendent forms of the good, of justice, of love, for example. And in so doing, he decides the first distribution of the elements of our field of knowledge. He decides the starting point. But in so doing this, representation is shown to be performative, just like Butler says that gender is performative. That in fact, it is its own presupposition. It is itself the bare form of presupposition, which insists that it is original, that it is the foundation. But Deleuze writes, for it is not figures already mediated and related to representation that are capable of carrying the faculties to their respective limits, but on the contrary, free or untamed states of difference in itself. Not qualitative opposition within the sensible, but an element which is in itself difference, and creates at once both the quality in the sensible and the transcendent exercise within sensibility. This element is intensity, understood as pure difference in itself, as that which is at once both imperceptible for empirical sensibility, which grasps intensity only already covered or mediated by the quality to which it gives rise, and at the same time that which can be perceived only from the point of view of a transcendental sensibility, which apprehends it immediately in the encounter. So intensity is Deleuze's way of getting out from the image of thought. Just in his critique of psychoanalysis in Anti-Oedipus, where there's a constant insistence merely upon a breath of fresh air, upon resisting the ability to assume the psychoanalyst's conception of the unconscious, for example, as reducible to the Oedipus complex. Instead, we must understand that there are in fact pure elements of difference, which is to say intensities, which are not reducible to an identity we already know. If we assume that, then we'd basically be in a closed circle. Instead, we recognize that, as Deleuze and Guattari say in A Thousand Plateaus, that something must always slip from the box, that you yourself are always slipping, and if you grasp these intensities, which are doing the majority of the work, you yourself can become imperceptible. And in so doing, you dissolve your subjectivity in the encounter. And this is really important when Deleuze writes, even the point of departure, namely sensibility in the encounter with that which forces sensation, presupposes neither affinity nor predestination. On the contrary, it is the fortuitous or the contingency of the encounter which guarantees the necessity of that which it forces to be thought. So thought is not limitless for Deleuze, insofar as it is constituted by the contingent relations of various encounters, of various flows interacting with each other in various ways. And as such, thought itself is rather fortuitous. It often results in violent encounters with, for example, ideas that are very foreign to us. And when we reach that point, we have the option to push back against those and, just reduce them or write them off. Or we have the possibility to let them infect us, to encounter them as unbridled as possible, and in so doing, necessitate the encounter itself instead of writing it off. And in terms of his conceptualization of the self and, what thought means, he writes here on page 145, there is indeed a serial connection between the faculties and an order in that series. But neither the order nor the series implies any collaboration with regard to the form of a supposed same object, or to a subjective unity in the nature of an I think. It is a forced and broken connection which traverses the fragments of a dissolved self as it does the borders of a fractured I. So what Deleuze is trying to say is, there is indeed a link of all our different perceptions and encounters in the form of a series, right? There is something which one can point to and say, like, this is me. But what Deleuze is trying to say is that, in fact, there are all sorts of rough edges of deterritorialization, as it's put in A Thousand Plateaus, which testify to the fragmentary notion of the I. That the I is always loosely defined and capable of being wrested from its stability. Now one might be tempted to ask, what does Deleuze want to put in place of the image of thought? What does he want to use to ground a revolutionary praxis in the very notion of thinking itself? Well, he supposes focusing on ideas with a capital I. But ideas precisely as something that, just as is the case with the self, is something fragmentary, something which encounters us, and something which is fundamentally defined not by the same, or by representation, or by a sort of comfortability or good sense, but rather by the notion of questions and problems, by the problematic itself. He writes, "Ideas are problems, but problems only furnish the conditions under which the faculties attain their superior exercise." Considered in this light, ideas, far from having as their milieu a good sense or a common sense, refer to a para-sense, which determines only the communication between disjointed faculties. Neither are they illuminated by a natural light. Rather, they shine like differential flashes which leap and metamorphose. And this is really crucial for building this sort of radical anti-philosophy, is that communication is not guaranteed. Communication is this momentary blip in which we get a sense of surety, of feeling stable, of understanding where we are. And in actuality, the unity of thought as ideas, in fact, testifies to the fact that there is a parasensible, the kind of things that cannot be reduced to our conceptualization, which in fact is the guarantee of the encounter, the guarantee of the fact that something is going to go away. He writes that the restitution of the idea in the doctrine of the faculties requires the explosion of the clear and distinct, and the discovery of a Dionysian value, according to which the idea is necessarily obscure insofar as it is distinct. All the more obscure, the more it is distinct. Distinction, obscurity, becomes here the true tone of philosophy, the symphony of the discordant idea. And this is hearkening back to the eternal return, where we are insisting on the only thing that is returning is not the same, but difference itself, which comes to explode our categories. And Deleuze quotes Artaud here, who says, "I am innately genital. There are some fools who think of themselves as beings, as innately being. I am he who, in order to be, must whip his innateness. One who innately must be a being, that is always whipping this sort of non-existent kennel, oh bitches of impossibility. Underneath grammar, there lies thought, an infamy harder to conquer, an infinitely more shrewdish maid, rougher to overcome when taken as an innate fact. For thought is a matron who has not always existed." And in response to this quote, Deleuze writes, "It is not a question of opposing to the dogmatic image of thought another image borrowed, for example, from schizophrenia, but rather of remembering that schizophrenia is not only a human fact, but a possibility for thought. One, moreover, which can only be revealed as such can through the abolition of that image. It is noteworthy that the dogmatic image, for its part, recognizes only error as a possible misadventure of thought, and reduces everything to the form of error." And this is very similar to how we talk about rationality today. And when talking about schizophrenic patients, schizophrenia is a favorite topic of both Artaud and Deleuze and Guattari. Schizophrenia is typically seen as an absence of the rational impulse, of the connection to the reality principle, of a disillusion with truth as such. But in actuality, it is very clear here that the way Deleuze, at least, wants to talk about schizophrenia is precisely insofar as it is considered an alternate image of thought. It is a possibility for thought. And that's an important way of phrasing it, because possibility is not very definite, and it's not supposed to be, precisely because the schizophrenic can conjunct all number of matters in a way that synthesizes it into a constantly evolving creative practice. For example, someone walks into the door and instantly becomes an FBI agent here to apprehend the schizophrenic and take them to do experiments on their brain. A dog can instantly turn into, I don't know, some cyborg covered in animal skin or whatever. You instantly have an abolition of a presupposed image of thought in an alternate way of thinking, which is able to take matters and mold them to suit an active process instead of a presupposed static image which must be returned to. And thus, Artaud insisting on these very, bitches of impossibility, of that's the kind of stuff that he wants to be worried about, is the impossible, of the non-existent which furnishes existence itself. And in line with this sort of grotesqueness, the like of de Sade, for example, he writes that cowardice, cruelty, baseness, and stupidity are not simply corporeal capacities or traits of character or society. They are structures of thought as such. The transcendental landscape comes to life. Places for the tyrant, the slave, and the imbecile must be found within it, without the place resembling the figure who occupies it, and without the transcendental ever being traced from the empirical figures which make it possible. And that's super important because he's, again, a lot of like the vital materialists, for example, the new materialists, as they've been called sometimes, they want to reduce Deleuze's theory to a form of materialism of, if we just know all the flows, we're good. No. Because all of these thinkers want to discount desire, which, desire is acting in this transcendental landscape of life, of something which, yes, depends upon and is equiprimordial with the material factors which are occupying this space, these empirical figures which make it possible. But at the same time, it depends on a vitality of thought, on a soberness of thought which can only be found by interacting with cowardice, cruelty, baseness, stupidity. These structures of thought as such, which, they don't make a neat little image of thought. In fact, they depend on the limp invalid as a destroyer of the dogmatic image of thought. As he writes, this ground, along with the individual, rises to the surface, yet assumes neither form nor figure. It is there, staring at us, but without eyes. The individual distinguishes itself from it, but it does not distinguish itself, continuing rather to cohabit with that which divorces itself from it. It is the indeterminate, but the indeterminate insofar as it continues to embrace determination, as the ground does the shoe. Animals are in a sense forewarned against this ground, protected by their explicit forms. Not so for the I and the self, undetermined by the fields of individuation which work beneath them, defenseless against a rising of the ground which holds up to them a distorted or distorting mirror in which all presently thought forms dissolve. Stupidity is neither the ground nor the individual, but rather this relation in which individuation brings the ground to the surface without being able to give it form. This ground rises by means of the I, penetrating deeply into the possibility of thought, and constituting the unrecognized in every recognition. And that unrecognized, That is the possibility for fatality, stupidity, creativity in all of Deleuze's thought. It's the quote-unquote unity of the I, which is in reality the eternal return, the pluralism equals monism that they spoke of in A Thousand Plateaus. And Deleuze really wants to shift his way of thinking about truth because of this. He writes that in every respect, truth is a matter of production, not of adequation. It is a matter of genitality, not of innateness or reminiscence. We cannot accept that the grounded remains the same as it was before, the same as when it was not grounded, when it had not passed the test of grounding. If sufficient reason or ground has a twist, this is because it relates what it grounds to that which is truly groundless. At this point, it must be said, there is no longer recognition. To ground is to metamorphose. Truth and falsity do not concern a simple designation, rendered possible by a sense which remains indifferent to it. The relation between a proposition and what it designates must be established within sense itself. The nature of ideal sense is to point beyond itself towards the object designated. And really, this is merely Deleuze saying that truth leaves its mark, that it is a shifting ground of process, which is really what the eternal return is. It's the returning of difference itself, as the differential as that which conjuncts different matters and makes things sensible. And in so doing this, repetition of difference, in like the refrain, for example, doesn't leave the ground stable. In fact, it upsets the ground and shows its true groundlessness. This is the idea for Deleuze. The idea itself is fundamentally groundless, and it requires this act of shifting itself. He writes here on page 155 that while it is true that we cannot express the sense of what we say, we can at least take the sense of a proposition, in other words, the expressed, as the designated of another proposition, of which in turn we cannot express the sense, and so on to infinity. As a result, if we call each proposition of consciousness a name, it is caught in an indefinite nominal regress, each name referring to another name which designates the sense of a preceding. However, the inability of empirical consciousness here corresponds to the nth power of the language and its transcendent repetition to be able to speak indefinitely of or about words themselves. In any case, thought is betrayed by the dogmatic image and by the postulate of propositions, according to which philosophy would find a beginning in a first proposition of consciousness, cogito. But perhaps cogito is the name which has no sense and no object other than the power of reiteration in indefinite regress. I think that I think that I think, ... Every proposition of consciousness implies an unconscious of pure thought, which constitutes the sphere of sense, in which there is infinite regress. So this very postulate of the cogito naturally leads to an eternal return, in which thought is this unity, quote unquote, but it's only unitary in the sense of the fact that it's always changing, that we can never give a definition to it without it slipping from us. And this is truly just the Nietzschean insistence that things aren't reducing like we think they do. And as such, Deleuze writes that sense is located in the problem itself. Sense is constituted in the complex theme, but the complex theme is that set of problems and questions in relation to which the propositions serve as elements of response and cases of solution. So he's focusing on the question, on the problematic, as that which grounds sense, precisely because the problematic incites movement. He writes that the failure to see that sense or the problem is extra-propositional, that it differs in kind from every proposition, leads us to miss the essential, the genesis of the act of thought, the operation of the faculties. Dialectic is the art of problems and questions, the combinatory or calculus of problems as such. However, dialectic loses its peculiar power when it remains content to trace problems from propositions. Thus begins the history of the long perversion which places it under the power of the negative. So, right, in a sense, Deleuze is a dialectician, insofar as dialectics is the art of problems and questions. It's problematizing that which exists, causing it to become. But of course the problem is, at this very moment, Hegel has to insist on the unity of being as Geist, right? And he has to make dialectics rational and reason-driven by contraposition, by negation. And in so doing this, the creativity of thought merely turns into a reproductivity of thought. And this leads to what is super profound about Deleuze, is that he wants to reimagine philosophy in order to take out all the dogmatism, at least as best as he can. He writes, "We are led to believe that problems are given ready-made, and that they disappear in the response or the solution. Already, under this double aspect, they can be no more than phantoms. We are led to believe that the activity of thinking, along with truth and falsehood in relation to that activity, begins only with the search for solutions, that both of these concern only solutions. This belief probably has the same origin as the other postulates of the dogmatic image. Puerile examples taken out of context and arbitrarily erected into models. According to this infantile prejudice, the master sets a problem. Our task is to solve it. And the result is accredited true or false by a powerful authority. It is also a social prejudice, with the visible interest of maintaining us in an infantile state, which calls upon us to solve problems that come from elsewhere, consoling or distracting us by telling us that we have won, simply by being able to respond. The problem as obstacle, and the respondent as Hercules. Such is the origin of the grotesque image of culture that we find in examinations and government referenda, as well as in newspaper competitions, where everyone is called upon to choose according to his or her taste, on condition that this taste coincides with that of everybody else. Be yourselves, it being understood that the self must be that of others. As if we could not remain slaves so long as we do not control the problems themselves, so long as we do not possess a right to the problems, to participation in and management of the problems. And this is very similar to what Jean Baudrillard says in Fatal Strategies of the necessity to be accountable to an identity today. That one must pay up, so to speak, and be understood, be known completely. That I must have someone who sees me perfectly. And this insistence on sight, on knowledge itself, on transparency, is precisely for Baudrillard the transparency of the subject in his own death, in his own going under, which reduces to a reproductive model. And Deleuze is saying the same thing. that when thought is understood merely as an act of coming to solutions, we naturally turn into a very institutionalized mode of thought, in which we merely function by models of, well, how do I go about solving problems? Oh, I do it this way because this is how everyone else does it. But in contrast to this, Deleuze writes that problems must be considered not as givens, data, but as ideal objecticities, possessing their own sufficiency in implying acts of constitution and investment in their respective symbolic fields. Far from being concerned with solutions, truth and falsehood primarily affect problems. A solution always has the truth it deserves according to the problem to which it is a response, and the problem always has the solution it deserves in proportion to its own truth or falsity. In other words, in proportion to its sense. This is what is meant by such famous formulae as, the really great problems are posed only once they are solved, or mankind always sets itself only such tasks as it can solve. Not because practical or speculative problems are only the shadow of pre-existing solutions, but on the contrary, because the solution necessarily follows from the complete conditions under which the problem is determined as a problem, from the means and the terms which are employed in order to pose it. The problem, or sense, is at once both the site of an originary truth and the genesis of a derived truth. So, Deleuze is trying to enact, when he's talking about problems as objecticities, he's giving them really an agency of their own, right? It's the agency of difference, of that autonomous nature of difference to repeat itself, and in so repeating, change itself, create, produce, that acts as the possibility for a non-dogmatic image of thought. It's realizing the limits of a particular solution and focusing on problematization as a creative possibility as such. Now, Deleuze synthesizes this all into a really fundamentally metaphysical way of talking about thought, ideas, truth, problems, which harkens back to, well, not back, I guess forward, to Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus, where instead of insisting on representation, we insist on multiplicity, on grounding our ontology in assemblages, which are driven by intensive differences. He writes that corresponding to the relations which constitute the universality of the problem is the distribution of singular points and distinctive points which determine the conditions of the problem. Problematic ideas are not simple essences, but multiplicities or complexes of relations and corresponding singularities. So, right, these singularities are the result of various tendencies of matters, of, something is expressed in such and such a way, thought of in such and such a way, and acts as a locus, as a point of homeostasis, per se. And thus, the notion of the problem itself, which Deleuze is trying to show that the notion of the problem itself constitutes the field of thought much more than the notion of solution does. That these problematic ideas, the notion that the idea, that the motor of thought, the nomos of thought, is the problematic itself, is in fact predicated upon the notion of multiplicities, or complexes of relations, or the thousand little selves, as he talked about in the last chapter. And he writes that in this manner, the distribution of singularities belongs entirely to the conditions of the problem, while their specification already refers to solutions constructed under these conditions. The problem is at once both transcendent and immanent in relation to its solutions, Transcendent because it consists in a system of ideal liaisons or differential relations between genetic elements. Immanent because these liaisons or relations are incarnated in the actual relations which do not resemble them and are defined by the field of solution. So, right, Deleuze is saying here that we have both a transcendental element of thought and an immanent element of thought. That we have actual immanent relations which are equiprimordial with the transcendental element of thought, with the sensible, with that which becomes expressible, with that which makes sense. And that by fettering these two together, by keeping a sober attention to the actual conditions that exist and figuring out what are the problems that I can pose that will cause something to change, what are the machines that I can create that will effectuate some kind of change, as it's put in Anti-Oedipus? In doing this, thought is a connection of this transcendental element and the immanent element together. And you might ask kind of more concretely, what is this constitution of kind of the unity of thought, so to speak? Thinking thought. Well, it's learning. And learning is wonderful because learning exemplifies the eternal return. It exemplifies the constantly shifting ground, the constant problematization of the field of knowledge. He writes on page 164 and 165, learning is the appropriate name for the subjective acts carried out when one is confronted with the objecticity of a problem, idea, whereas knowledge designates only the generality of concepts or the calm possession of a rule enabling solutions. A well-known test in psychology involves a monkey who is supposed to find food in boxes of one particular color amidst others of various colors. There comes a paradoxical period during which the number of errors diminishes, even though the monkey does not yet possess the knowledge or truth of a solution in each case. Propitious moment in which the philosopher monkey opens up to truth, himself producing the true, but only to the extent that he begins to penetrate the colored thickness of a problem. We see here how the discontinuity among answers is engendered on the basis of the continuity of an ideal apprenticeship. How truth and falsity are distributed according to what one understands of a problem, and how the final truth, when it is obtained, emerges as though it were the limit of a problem completely determined and entirely understood, or the product of those genetic series which constitute the sense, or the outcome of a genesis which does not take place only in the head of a monkey. To learn is to enter into the universal of the relations which constitute the idea, and into their corresponding singularities. So the question, for Deleuze, as he puts it, is under torsions determined by the singularities of which idea will thought be aroused. This is a perpetual openness to learning by being in between knowledge, in which tendency, which is to say intensity, established by the force of the problematic, is achieved by not being reducible to knowledge or truth. It's that moment in which one is learning, one is adapting, but without yet reducing these actions to simply truth or falsity. Instead, this is a turbulent, rhizomatic image of thought instead of a dogmatic, arborescent one. And his thesis can be summed up here in the last sentences of this chapter. The postulates need not be spoken. They function all more effectively in silence, in this presupposition with regard to the essence, as well as in the choice of examples. Together, they form the dogmatic image of thought. They crush thought under an image which is that of the same and the similar in representation, but profoundly betrays what it means to think and alienates the two powers of difference and repetition, of philosophical commencement and recommencement. The thought which is born in thought, the act of thinking, which is neither given by innateness nor presupposed by reminiscence, but engendered in its genitality, is a thought without image. So I hope this has been helpful for understanding Deleuze's critique of the image of thought, his freeing of thought from presuppositions, his insistence on pure difference, on intensities, on the problematic, and on the themes of stupidity, cruelty, and genitality. Check out any of my other lectures that I've done on the rest of this work, on Deleuze and Guattari, on other postmodernists, German idealists, gender theorists. Leave any constructive or non-constructive criticism in the comments below, and I'll see you in another lecture.